Before the modern day of the corridor digital-esque one-wheel skateboarding hipsters kind of zipping through VFX with simple clicks of the mouse, there used to be a time when VFX artists were not just artists, they were engineers. They were sort of like these crotchety old men that really knew their craft and were just as much scientists as they were artists. And I believe today we're seeing sort of like a kind of a push away from that because back then VFX was extremely meticulous. We have it so easy today. Optical printers back in the day were cumbersome. The idea of how everything had to be recreated in a tactile reality of models and maquettes and LED lights, and it was just absolutely insane. And all of that having to be brought down into scale and photographed at high-speed motion control systems. And at the forefront of this unbelievable advancement has always been Douglas Trumbull, who has been credited, almost been depended upon by some of the greatest film directors in all times of Hollywood. And to this day, Doug is still pressing the envelope in trying to fight the mission of keeping theaters around in a way, because it's important to understand that immersive, the idea of immersive, is what pulled us from television back into the theaters with CinemaScope and so forth. And again, the same thing going on with 3D or high frame rates. And the goal is for us not to be sort of like subjugated to stay inside and watch movies on big screens, which is nothing wrong with that. But again, as we're going to go through this sort of little research project I did, you'll see how Doug really does have an understanding that the experience, it's not just an experience, it's a group experience, it's a community experience of experiencing a movie in theaters. And he honestly, truly believes that if we don't come up with another invention, such as Cinescope or 3D or something, then we might very well, especially since COVID hit, we'll see the death of the actual theaters. Now, nobody likes the popcorn prices and the obnoxious commercials we got to deal with. But at the same time, he does have a good sort of message in regards to the understanding that the theater going experience is an experience that is a community experience. It's a group experience where everybody laughs together and everybody cries together. So let's journey back in time into the crazy world of Trumbull. So this is going to be a rather brief history of a man who has spanned over 70 years of industry and just innovation. So I'm not going to kind of go through every film he's ever made, and I won't even probably go into a lot of the stuff he's done, but I think it's more along the lines I wanted to convey his mindset and his philosophy, because I think that's a philosophy we need to carry over into the VFX world. So this is relentless immersion into time and space. You're going to see how this man presses time and space. So in his day, he didn't have digital stuff, but he was pressing higher resolution, faster frame rates, and not to make them look like soap operas. He actually has a patent technology of his that allows for that weird soap opera look to go away at a higher frame rate. So it's kind of cool to see like him trying to solve these problems that we whine about all the time. So the history of Doug is he began as a sort of graphics artist at a company called Graphic Films, and right from the start he was sort of like, it's interesting because he was almost like born into the world of immersive. So he helped out at the New York World's Fair for a film which I believe was 18 frames per second. It was To the Moon and Beyond. And this was the beginning of CinemaScope, which was this press to get people back in theaters. So they did something desperate, like put three actual cameras together and three projectors and projected three different images with horrible seams in the middle, but to get a widescreen effect. They had not yet created the anamorphic CinemaScope just yet, but it was right around the corner. So they were using the same technique, but instead using fisheye lenses to project onto this dome here at the fair to create this immersive experience as if you were going to the moon. And two very prominent, one being a film director, one being a novelist, Arthur C. Clarke, and also Stanley Kubrick were there watching this, realizing that this company, Graphic Films, would be one of the companies they'd use to get 2001 up and running, so to speak. So here's a little backstory from Doug himself talking about his experiences.
Working at this company called Graphic Films in Hollywood that did space films for NASA and the Air Force. And they ended up doing a film, we ended up doing a film for the New York World's Fair in 1964 called To the Moon and Beyond. And it was all multiplane photography, fisheye lenses projected into a dome theater. This was the dome theater here on the left. It was called the Travel and Transportation Pavilion. It was a weird film format called Cinerama 360, which was 10 perforation, 70 millimeter film. The image was circular and photographed with fisheye lenses and wide-angle lenses, projected with fisheye lenses into a kind of a planetarium dome theater. And the show was called To the Moon and Beyond.
There was a time when motion pictures looked like this. Then an enterprising entrepreneur came along.
Lowell Thomas speaking. You are about to see the first
Beginning where they were using 3 projectors. I'm not sure if Doug's film was one camera, just shot with fisheye lenses, but this is where they were starting to introduce three specific cameras that would get onto 3 projectors and have an immersive experience, and that would escape the sort of box aspect ratio that kept people staying home because, like, hey, why do I have to go to a theater to look at a box? I have a box at home. It's called a television. So here they brought the widescreen reality. And people came out in droves for this. They wanted more. Eventually they developed CinemaScope, which is the anamorphic tool sets of capturing things cylindrically and then expanding them out upon projection.
Cinerama gives us just about the full scope of normal vision in which you see so much out of the corner of your eye.
This is the actual camera. They did an anniversary reshoot just for fun. And look at just how absolutely ridiculous this would be. 3 sort of almost, not perfectly in sync, cameras, and you're having to film them. This is not...
Stanley Kubrick and Arthur Clarke saw this show, which I had done all the illustrations for, which were part of the multiplane photography. And Graphic Films got a job to start doing some preliminary early design work for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which at the time was called Journey Beyond the Stars in a very early draft. And this is one of my early pencil sketches for a kind of a lunar base. You can see some similarity here to, the horizon on the moon, the Earth in the distance.
So eventually Doug invented Slit scan, which had to do with a camera exposing while moving forward and backward on a dolly track and filming a slit, and the slit would actually record like colored gels, and it would give you this weird 3D effect. We could do this in After Effects very easily today, but you could still see this really, really awesome effect that was used in 2001 to both show visibly time and space being altered. I really like what Doug says. He says old optical VFX, they age well. And he's right. If you look at Blade Runner, if you look at these films, they age well, unlike CG, which is sort of like, you just kind of pass it off. But these VFX, despite, being very rough back in the day, they definitely have a good tactile holding over time. So now we're going to get into a lot of what Doug did was a lot of building of motion control systems and so forth. He patented a lot of stuff, and I think the patenting obviously, kept him financially secure. So he was, being known for his motion control work and so forth, all his technological innovations, and that brought him onto Blade Runner and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So you got Spielberg and Ridley Scott relying on this man to get their visual effects done.
C'est ce qui en fait qui est unique dans l'histoire du cinéma.
Doug is really one of the great
the greats of the evolution of where we are today, and he's stayed ahead of it. He's already ahead of what he thinks we should be doing.
The idea was that the Stargate represented the transition through space and time to another dimension. And so Keir Delay starts out shaking. Stanley Kubrick and Jeffrey Unsworth worked out a way to ramp the exposure and the frame rate during the shot, so that during this shot the movie goes from 24 frames a second to maybe 1 frame every 5 seconds. And so that as Keir Delay starts to shake, he becomes increasingly blurred. And so there's the component of time entering the shot. I had an amazing experience working for Stanley Kubrick because I had never made a movie before. I didn't know anything about directing. I knew almost nothing about production. I'd never been on a set. And here I was, this young 23-year-old animator, and Stanley Kubrick is my mentor. He's teaching me about movies. And we began forming this intimate trust because I kept solving problems for him. Maybe I was solving problems because I was a clean slate. I had no objective, I had no pattern, I wasn't stuck in any particular form. And so I could think as he was thinking, telling me, Doug, do something that no one's ever done before. That's what I want. If everybody does it that way, I want you to do it that way. I said, okay, I get it. The sense of adventure that comes with exploring the unknown is what really gets me excited.
So Doug continued to work for traditional 24 frames per second, 35 millimeter film workflow. He worked on Blade Runner. He did this amazing blimp shot, which he took shots of the Bradbury Building in Los Angeles, did multiple exposures, physically cut out these little holes on a glass pane and have all these different passes run through from, and using the technology he had from Close Encounters of the Third Kind to create this incredible shot, which still holds today. Again, if you guys haven't seen the original 1982 Blade Runner, you really need to check it out. And again, here's the Hades landscape with etched brass, and that's how they basically edged the edges of like pieces of brass, and they built all these little cutouts, and they used forced perspective, having all the way back to the very end here. Just amazing, again, tactile model work, little tiny models and so forth, and multiple passes with his motion control system for these flames. But again, you can just sense that this guy wanted more. He wanted to go a little bit further, a little bit farther, and the technology had not caught up yet, but he was determined at the time not to sit down and wait for the digital revolution to kick in. Which is this pioneer spirit attitude. You could say that, again, he was locked in a temporal normality, he's just living a life in traditional narrative sense, and not really touching upon what would almost be somewhat experimental as opposed to narrative, and being immersive and letting all the different elements of story go away and just allowing the audience to come into the picture itself. Back in the day, there was a movie called Easy Rider, and the youth of that generation loved it, and Hollywood said, well, how are we going to get butts in the seats? Well, we want to have 5 filmmakers. We'll give them, complete artistic freedom. Give them $1 million of the 5 artists, and they can make whatever movie they want, and hopefully it'll click with the youth. So Doug was one of those 5. He was chosen to work on to make a film. So he wrote a film called Silent Running, and Silent Running was about this spaceship that was carrying the last bit of agriculture or greenery or what have you, sort of like spherical domes holding botanical gardens, and and it was basically that was it. The Earth had actually destroyed all of its trees, and so you got that sort of environmental movement that was really getting big back then. And he sort of like wanted to make that into a story, and it's a really actually a pretty good film. I used to watch it a lot with my dad back when I was a kid. It was just a real fascinating movie with a lot of like miniature sets and so forth, and they filmed it and even shot it all on a real decommissioned aircraft carrier, which was pretty crazy. There's some really great making ofs on that if you look around on YouTube. So anyway, I wanted to bring up the fact that I remember seeing this clip as a kid from the movie Silent Running and saying, you know, Doug wrote this script. So it's interesting. I think his philosophy, as far as even technology, is even sort of echoed in his film. So I'll show you just one clip here.
And it has a smell. And that it calls back a time when there were flowers all over the earth, and there were valleys, and there were plains of tall green grass that you could lie down in, that you could go to sleep in. And there were blue skies, and there was fresh air, and there were things growing all over the place, not just in some domed enclosures blasted some millions of miles out into space. Look at that stuff. How can you guys sit there and really say anything to me about this? Look at this crap. Look at that. Dried synthetic crap. And you've become so dependent on it that I bet you can't even live without it.
What do we want, Lowell?
Don't you realize how pitiful that is, what you just asked me? On Earth, everywhere you go, the temperature is 75 degrees. Everything is the same. All the people are exactly the same. Now, what kind of life is that?
Well, if it's so rotten, why do you want to go back?
Because it's not too late to change it.
What do you want, Lowell? I mean, there's hardly any more disease, there's no more poverty. Nobody's out of a job.
That's right. Every time we have the argument, you say the same thing to me. You give me the same three answers all the time. The same thing, well, everybody has a job. That's always the last one. But you know what else there is no more of, my friend? There is no more beauty. And there's no more imagination. And there are no frontiers left to conquer. And you know why? Only one reason why. One reason why. The same attitude that you three guys are giving me right here in this room today. And that is, nobody cares.
So again, it's just interesting, you know, you can just kind of sense an echoing of the spirit of Doug in the midst of this film, because it's really about wanting to see change and so forth, and nothing really happening. And you can just see throughout his career he's pushing the envelope. So he goes from his slit scan technology to show scan. For some reason he loves the word scan. I don't know why that is, or just coincidence, but anyway, he was pressing, again, before the digital revolution had hit, the desire for higher frame rates. So he would shoot 70 millimeter at 60 frames per second to give it hyper-real feel. In fact, he did a demonstration by bringing in George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and all these famous filmmakers, and brought them to a theater and had them watch a film that was projected and that broke, and then a projectionist comes out and walks to the front of the stage and says, "I'm so sorry, folks, it broke. We don't know what's going on." And so the film directors were looking around at Doug going, "Oh man, this is a pretty pathetic showing of your new technology." What they didn't realize is that projectionist they saw on the screen was actually back projected from behind the actual screen, and it was actually a projection, not a real person they were talking to. So it was so real, they were not realizing they were looking at somebody that was not even really there, that was instructing them, "Hey, we're sorry, we apologize, the show has failed," and so forth. So that was the mentality, is trying to press into the minds of some of the greatest filmmakers new technologies that would really get the immersive going. And again, financially, film back then, 70 millimeter film was very expensive. You run that through at 60 frames per second, you're talking very costly, both in the process of, you know, the film cost of shooting and then obviously projecting, and it just isn't feasible at the time. So here again we see this is Doug trying to build, even today, this immersive filmmaking as a new language of cinema, constantly pushing this immersive reality.
All movies and television are what I call a third-person medium. The audience is a third-person, non-participating, non-involved voyeur who's watching something else happen. They watch somebody kill somebody else, someone kiss someone else, someone chase someone else, someone discover something. It started, way back around the turn of the century with the first motion pictures. A language emerged that you could change the camera angle and people would go with a cut. If you cut from this angle to that angle or to a close-up, people would intuitively understand that that's what they were supposed to be looking at. And that became a cinematic language that I would call third person, because the presence of the camera is not acknowledged. It's not happening directly to the audience. Kubrick is making this movie, and he felt the responsibility to create a kind of epic, like How the West Was Won or Lawrence of Arabia. And so he started moving away from the normal conventions of melodrama and stripping away a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the story and even a lot of the plot in exchange for this immersive experience for the audience to feel like they were on this voyage with the cast and that they were actually going into space, not just the characters. Some transition through time and space in the Stargate, for instance. The thing that anybody would do was an over-the-shoulder shot of Keir Delay in the foreground of the Stargate out the window, or a shot over the shoulder of the pod moving through the Stargate, or a reverse angle in the Stargate of the pod approaching the camera. Those are all the standard shots any director would put into a movie. Kubrick realized that they forced the audience out of the movie. He said, I'm not going to use those shots at all. I'm going to stay with the point of view. So the audience becomes Keir Delay. The audience is going on this adventure themselves. We're a laboratory where we experiment with actors, with sets, with props, with cameras, with lenses, with screens, with projectors, with microphones. And this is a laboratory of trying to discover the future of cinema, or a future of cinema. I don't want to change the whole industry. I think it's just fine. But if you want to make an immersive experience, the director and the writer have got to think about it differently. It's a different art form. And we're now right at the very beginning of developing a new language, which is immersive, which allows the camera to be present. It allows the audience to be present. So that's what I've been developing here, is this process of 3D 4K to 120 frames per second. We're shooting on the stage today with cameras that are 1 inch by 1 inch with tiny lenses, and we can project that on this really wide, deeply curved screen and get an incredibly immersive experience. What I'm trying to do is bring this technology to the movie industry and get other directors to look at it, think about it, see if they like it, experiment with it.
It's important to note that a lot of you are probably at this time going, "Oh, didn't James Cameron do this? Didn't they do this on Gemini Man and it sucked? Nobody liked it. It looked like a soap opera." Well, Doug actually has a patented technology called cadence, which has to do with the way that the image is recorded back and forth, left eye, right eye, left eye, right eye. So it's 60 frames per second per eye at a total of 120 frames per second. And the process gets rid of the soap opera look to it, according to what everyone that has seen it, and he even vouches for it himself. So he's not like sort of repeating what James Cameron did, but he's trying to solve all of these problems, but at the same time continue the fight to become more immersive in the storytelling process.
And so exploring the language of storytelling as it relates to immersion is the key to the kingdom of the future of entertainment, is understanding how to create the same drama or even better drama than any director has ever written or photographed. Circle around these guys. And once we get coordinated with whoever's running that rig and whoever's doing the panning and tilting, we'll just keep rehearsing that until we get it smooth. I like the social experience of movies, where a lot of people can see something simultaneously and all laugh together, all cry together, all talk to each other and be in the room together. There's energy in a room full of people. It's now time to make the next step, which is 5 times the frame rate, 4 times the resolution, and at least 2 or 3 times the brightness of 3D. That I know of who's ever done a laboratory experiment showing movies at different frame rates to see how people react to frame rates as the only variable, using electrocardiogram, electroencephalogram, galvanic skin response, electromyogram, Now we could do that very easily, but we could also do real-time functional magnetic resonance imaging or PET scans to map visual cortex stimulation with frame rates as one of the questions you're asking yourself. So frame rate stimulation is directly related to how fast something's moving across the screen. The faster it's moving, the more frames you need to keep it clear. I'm basically frustrated with 24 frames a second. I just think it just doesn't cut it anymore. It was a limitation imposed a zillion years ago by acetate film running through sprocketed projectors and mechanical movements, and the limitations of shredding the film or not wanting to use too much of it because it's expensive. Those constraints are now gone, and I think we can store almost any image. Storage is really not a big cost. I mean, you can buy a terabyte of storage at Staples for $100. So don't be afraid of storage or bandwidth. So I think we're going to just see things starting to get more and more vivid and more real, which are also related to brightness, perceived brightness, which is directly related to perceived color saturation and contrast. It's not just frame rates, it's a whole bunch of things. It's field of view, contrast, brightness, color saturation, clarity, acuity, blurring, strobing, flickering, all kinds of things are going on simultaneously. So I don't know what the perfect answer is, but I sure love playing in that territory and try to figure out what I want to do next, because I want to break out of this mold. And this show scan thing proved to me that we can shoot at, we shot this at 120 frames, and we could perfectly extract 60, 48, or 24 seamlessly that looked exactly like it had been shot that way. Because you can shoot with a 360 shutter and blend any number of frames together and create a new frame that's as though the shutter were open longer, as though we were shooting at a lower frame rate. I personally believe that a lot of the excitement and enthusiasm about virtual reality is related to a kind of personal, individual desire for immersive experience, something that goes beyond television and beyond movies. So that's why I call it experience making, as different from storytelling.
So again, you see that, scientific or engineer aspect that we don't have today in VFX artists. They are there, obviously. They're building up new technologies and different post houses, but again, just having a respect for the old school mentality and the fact that a lot of these artists that started out in VFX were originally scientists, engineers, and so forth. The last thing I want to end with is going back to go forward, a respect for the retro, a reality that in the midst of all this digital revolution, we're using tools to make things quicker, cheaper, faster, get things out the door, but it's creating a pattern, and humans are very keen on picking up on patterns, and we're seeing a pattern and even also a limitation of things that we see as far as visual effects. And what I love about Doug is he wants to go back to filming organic photography. Yes, it's more work. Yes, it's painstaking. Yes, it's not as flashy as CG, but it is different. That's the thing. It's different. And I think that's what he's trying to achieve. And it may not be revolutionary, but at the same time, it's a different way of thinking. In the same way that, Stanley Kubrick came to him and said, everyone's doing it this way. I want you to do it another way.
It's like an elixir, magic potion. And it's part of my philosophy that we can use what I call organic effects. It's not computer graphics. That can all be done with a few mouse clicks in a computer, but I really like the idea of doing things naturally. So I hope we're going to see some of the stuff that we are developing now for my next film, which will have a very high degree of organic effects in it, including liquids, tanks, dyes, high-speed photography, slow-speed photography, and ways of creating mysterious and beautiful simulations of planets or stars or galaxies, but not using actual photographs of the real thing.
This is in Doug's sort of laboratory in Massachusetts. He has a whole team of people working together. That's my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll continue to do more episodes of different VFX legends of the past and present.